Welcome to Scriptura's layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 46. God is our fortress. Though the earth change, and the mountains topple into the heart of the deepest sea, though its waters foam in rage, and the mountains quake at its surging, we will not fear. Psalm 46 opens with imagery of global chaos, and yet finishes with one of the most well-known calls to surrender to God and to honor Him. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted throughout the earth. Psalm 46 narrates a story from the perspective of a city that strong enemy forces are threatening. Even though the psalm offers no details about the city's identity, it is most likely Jerusalem, because the city in the psalm has a close association with the Lord, Israel's God. In the psalm, the city faces mighty enemies, which are first described using a metaphor of chaotic natural forces, raging stormy waters, shaking mountains, and the changing earth. Later, the psalm identifies these forces as nations and kingdoms. However, their aggression cannot defeat the city, since God Himself is present there. He's a refuge, a stronghold, and a mighty fortress for the city's residents. The psalm traces the city's journey from the threat of chaos to peace and security, and offers a vision that the Lord is stronger than any threat of chaos, stronger than any nation or enemy, stronger than anything. And He will make His greatness known when He shows His power over all things. The phrase, God is our fortress, identifies the one fact that determines the fate of this city. When the rest of the earth is trembling and even falling into the sea, only the city is left, not shaken and not moved, because God is the city's protection. Other cities have strong walls and guarded safe places that enemies cannot enter in order to protect and defend the people, but this city has God to keep everyone safe. Psalm 46 has 3 sections, each comparing God to a refuge, a stronghold, and a fortress, which shelter God's people from all kinds of threats. All these images of ancient buildings used in war refer to safe places where people would run for protection if they were in danger. The first section we've titled, Stronger Than Chaos. Here, powerful natural forces create the most terrible disaster a person can imagine. Raging, stormy waters cause the earth and mountains to shake and slide into the deepest part of the sea. Later in the psalm, it becomes clear these forces represent nations and kingdoms that threaten the city of God and His people, but do not defeat them. God, who is stronger than chaos, shelters His people, so they do not need to fear after all. Although the threat from chaotic forces is real, and the city and its residents may feel anxious, the greater reality that God is stronger than chaos calms their fear. Knowing that God is stronger gives them confidence, and this feeling of confidence is what the psalm creates for the listeners as the poem develops. In the second section, Stronger Than Nations, the nations openly rage against Israel. But, like the mountains before them, kingdoms topple and fall down when God thunders with His voice. The threat in the first section becomes a defeated enemy in the second section. Instead of fearing their enemies, which were at first pictured as raging, stormy waters, God's people benefit from the waters of a river with many streams. These, in turn, gladden the city of God, providing a dependable water supply and security to survive any attack. Since this city is cared for in this way, it cannot be destroyed. That defeated enemy from the second section becomes a devastated enemy in the third section. All the weapons of war are destroyed. Here, God devastates the earth, humiliating the hostile forces and their raging and threats of violence. However, the violence suddenly stops in verse 11. The Lord speaks and demands everyone and everything surrender and attention. Be still and know that I am God. Thus, the section ends with God asserting that He alone is God. He alone is stronger than all, and He alone is exalted over all. The psalm concludes by repeating that God is a fortress for His people, who shelters them from all threats. The psalm ends with the people's confidence in their God and their reverence for the kind of God He is, a God who is stronger than all. The psalm first presents the threat of enemies using the image of chaos in nature, earthquakes, storms, and landslides. The obvious conclusion from these images would be that nothing could escape these disasters. Even so, the city of God can be confident in God, its refuge and stronghold. The anxiety people feel over the threat fades away because God is stronger than chaos, stronger than enemy nations, and indeed stronger than all the earth. The one who is stronger than everything and everyone is Israel's safe place, their fortress. This means that God's people are sheltered from all threats. The drama in Psalm 46 owes much to the imagery the psalmist uses. The first image is God as a refuge, a stronghold, and a fortress. All these buildings are built to be strong and to resist attacks. In the imagery, these buildings are part of the city of God. Cities were places that showed that a people group was strong in the ancient world. They were the political and cultural centers for the group. In ancient warfare, enemy kings would engage in herbicide, that is, the killing or destruction of their opponents' cities. Full herbicide would include burning a city to the ground and turning it into a heap of ruins. Psalm 46 may be seen as a way of mocking the enemy's attempt to destroy the city. God Himself becomes part of the city's buildings. In the imagery and metaphors, God is part of the defensive buildings that make the city strong and impossible for enemies to attack successfully. Representing God this way shows that the city can never be destroyed. Another prominent image in the psalm is that of alcoholic intoxication. Notably, the raging stormy waters in the first section and the refreshing river and its streams in the second section are described with certain verbs that are often linked to wine and other alcoholic beverages in the Hebrew Bible. In Psalm 46, the swirling, stormy waters foam or ferment like wine, and the river and its streams gladden the city as good wine would. In the Hebrew Bible, various aspects of winemaking and alcohol production are used frequently to describe warfare. Thus, forcing someone to drink wine and become drunk was a metaphor for assault, judgment, and destruction. Defeated people were those who drink and can no longer walk straight without falling. People who resist the attack are those who don't get drunk and remain standing. Something important for interpreting Psalm 46 is the image of the cup of wrath, which is often repeated in the Hebrew Bible. In Habakkuk 2, for example, we read, "Alas for you Chaldeans who make your neighbors drink. Drink, you yourself, and stagger. The cup in the Lord's right hand will come around to you." Similarly, in Psalm 46, the enemy forces, the waters and the nations, swirl, foam, ferment, and surge like wine, presumably to get God's people drunk, which was a way of talking about judgment and defeat. Yet, in a reversal of fortune, the enemy kingdoms and nations are the ones falling down like drunk people in verse 7. To protect His city, the Lord gets the attackers drunk, intoxicating His own people positively, gladdening them. God ensures their safety. The psalm does not say that it was written about a particular historical incident, but it is helpful to recall a few moments in Israel's history that might explain the imagery. In 701 BCE, for instance, King Sennacherib of Assyria sent his army throughout the land, defeating kingdom after kingdom. In 2 Kings 18 and 19, and Isaiah 36 and 37, we have the record that the Assyrians attacked all the strong cities of Judah and took control of them. King Hezekiah expected to be trapped inside Jerusalem without food or water. So he secretly changed the course of the spring of Gihon so the city would have fresh water and be able to survive the attack. The Assyrians blocked the entrances and exits in Jerusalem, trapping everyone inside, mocking their belief that God would save the city. However, the siege ended with a miracle. An angel completely destroyed the Assyrian army, killing 185,000 Assyrian soldiers overnight. Some aspects of Sennacherib's campaign against Jerusalem line up with the Psalm's warfare imagery, particularly the metaphor of warfare as intoxication. First, as Sennacherib marches through the region, mighty kingdoms get attacked or intoxicated, toppling or falling in defeat to a chaotic, aggressive enemy, Assyria. Second, while under siege, Jerusalem gets to enjoy a fresh water supply that refreshes and protects it, keeping its heart glad. Thus, the city is attacked and trapped, but not defeated. Third, the aggressive enemy, Assyria, gets defeated by God himself. Significantly, 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah 37 speak of how Hezekiah and his people rise in the morning after the miracle God did to save them, and find Sennacherib's camp full of corpses. Similarly, the psalm speaks of God living in the city and in the morning coming to rescue it. Finally, during Sennacherib's campaign against Judah, the prophet urges Hezekiah to rely on God's support. "In quietness and trust will be your strength." This advice echoes the Psalm's call to God's people and the nations to be still and know that the Lord is God. We'll now proceed through the psalm section by section.
For the music director, by the Korahites, as young women, a psalm. God is a refuge and stronghold for us. He is readily available as a help in great trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth change and the mountains topple into the heart of the deepest sea, though its waters foam in rage, though mountains quake at its surging. Selah.
The superscription reads, "For the music director, by the Korahites, as young women, a psalm." The music director refers to the music director in the Israelite temple, so this would be a song for public worship. The Korahites were one of the important families of leaders at the Jerusalem temple. They were descendants of the man Korah and his followers, people who rebelled against Moses and were swallowed up by the earth in Numbers 16. Rebellion is a prominent theme in some of the Korahite psalms. The phrase, "as young women," may indicate that people should sing this psalm like a choir of young women. This followed the cultural practice of women, especially young women, celebrating military victories. Ancient writers and artists often represented cities as females. And in ancient artwork, cities under attack were often shown with women crying on the city walls. The women represented both the suffering people of the city and the cities themselves. So the choir of women here may refer to an even deeper cultural idea, if the young women are understood to personify or stand in for the city itself. Additionally, in the ancient world, songs of sadness, called laments, were written about destroyed cities from the point of view of the city's goddesses, and they were sung in a dialect associated with women. This would suggest that in the poem, the city is playing a central role. Young women, or a choir imitating young women, had the responsibility to speak on behalf of the city, particularly to express sadness over being attacked and defeated, and also to celebrate victory. This psalm does not speak from the perspective of an individual or king. It speaks from the perspective of the city. In the psalm, the city of God is introduced explicitly in the second section, but it is implied in the first section, with first-person plural references, us in verse 2 and we in verse 3. The river mentioned as part of the city in the second section was not part of Jerusalem's real geography, but within the context of the entire book of Psalms, the idea of the city of God would immediately be connected with Jerusalem. The first section is full of images of chaos or natural disaster, the natural forces of the earth, raging stormy waters and shaking mountains, metaphorically stand for hostile human forces, the nations and kingdoms mentioned explicitly in verse 7. They likely refer to powerful nations throughout Israel's history: Egypt, Assyria, Babylonia, and Persia. If the psalm refers to Sennacherib's siege, the enemy is Assyria. The poem opens by giving the context. Enemies are threatening the city of God, and the people of God are responding to the threat. They cry out, "God is a refuge and stronghold for us. He's readily available as a help in great trouble." Great trouble is not an exaggeration. The very existence of the city of God was threatened many times over. In addition to Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem in the 8th century BC, we know of at least 2 other attacks when Egyptian pharaoh Shishak attacked Jerusalem under Rehoboam's reign in the 10th century BC, and when the kingdoms of Aram, Damascus, and Israel together fought against Judah when Ahaz was king in the 8th century BC. The people here declare that God will protect his city Jerusalem and keep it strong against every threat. Other cities were not safe in the same way because they did not have God himself as part of the city's defensive buildings. Readily available as a help is a tremendous statement of confidence. Only very great danger would require such confidence. The city of God is in trouble. However, the people have confidence in its defenses because its defenses are God himself. The serious trouble is expressed using images of chaos from the natural world, the earth changing, as happens with earthquakes or other natural disasters, even mountains falling down or toppling into the sea, as happens with landslides after an earthquake. No human force can endure such powerful violence. People would laugh at the idea of claiming not to be afraid of these forces, unless there was an even greater force serving as protection. Being fearless implies that even though the greatest natural forces on earth are very powerful, God is even more powerful. The foaming waters are another image from nature, but one which also references another world of imagery, that of alcohol and drunkenness. The foaming waters that aggressively threaten the city of God are like fermenting wine an enemy wants to use to make the city drunk. This would make it vulnerable and unable to defend itself. Seen in this light, the mountains could be viewed as already drunkenly defeated. They're quaking and toppling into the sea and cannot resist the flood of foaming water. If the mountains cannot resist the rushing waters, who could? Indeed, in Isaiah 36, the Assyrian commander mocked Jerusalem for trusting God to protect them. The gods of neighboring countries have failed to protect them from defeat. How then can the Lord deliver Jerusalem from my hand? Why would Jerusalem expect to be stronger than the much more powerful neighboring kingdoms and states who were defeated by the Assyrians? The most terrifying threats of war are pictured as the most terrifying threats of nature. The earth as people know it permanently changes shape as floodwaters foam and mountains disappear. This terrifying movement contrasts with the fearless confidence the people have in their stability. Even though the earth and the mountains can be moved in disasters, they feel secure that with God as the defensive building of their city, they will not be moved from their place and destroyed.
There is a river whose streams gladden the city of God, the holy dwelling of the Most High. God is in its midst. It cannot be moved. God helps it at the approach of morning. When nations raged and kingdoms fell down, then he thundered with his voice, and the earth would melt. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is a fortress for us. Selah.
The poem suddenly replaces the picture of foaming, swirling, uncontrollable waters that threaten to attack and defeat God's city with the new picture of a river in the second section, stronger than nations. The streams of this river bring pleasure and delight to the people in the city. They provide the most basic need in a time of war, fresh water to drink, so the city can resist an attack. This imagery reminds us of the irrigation projects that ancient kings directed. They would build canal systems to supply water to their cities and the surrounding regions, and they used those canals as part of the city's defensive structures. These royal projects remind us of Hezekiah's tunnel, which brought the water from the spring of Gihon flowing into Jerusalem. As part of the alcohol imagery, the river and its waters, in the second section, represent the pleasant side of drinking wine. Instead of making the city drunk and vulnerable, it makes the city glad, like wine at a celebration. Here, this celebration image shows that the city is safe, and God has provided what they needed. Hebrew poets often like to pair opposites. This river gladdens the city, a good effect, and does not make it drunk and weak, a bad effect. Instead of walking unsteadily and falling, they are not moved, meaning they are not drunk to the point of being vulnerable. Because the city's God is present, everyone who attacks it fails. The end result is delight and provision instead of defeat. The city is more than adequately defended. It is rejoicing. Verse 7 conveys how God defended the city. He went on the offensive. As noted before, the chaos of natural disasters in the first section poetically represents the violence and instability that come with political disasters and war in the second section. When the nations and kingdoms threatened God's people, like stormy waters, these aggressive enemies met God, and he made them fall down, defeated. Just like the mountains the poem described earlier, these enemy forces lost their balance and fell to the ground. Earlier in the poem, the earth itself melted in response to God. If we think about this scene, and then think about Sennacherib's war in the Levant, and the time he attacked Jerusalem, we may think of the Assyrians as the nations who were like the foaming waters, making other kingdoms fall defeated. But when they met God, Israel's defender, he was the most powerful of all. If we remember that the imagery of drunkenness is a way of picturing being defeated in war, and when we read the second section, we may view defeated nations in terms of being made weak and vulnerable by their drunken state. The idea that God's people are confident in verse 2 is repeated in verse 8, almost like a victory cry. The Lord of hosts, meaning the Lord who commands the armies of heaven, is with his city. The hostile forces, natural and human, are no match for the armies of heaven, which will win every time. The God of Jacob, the God who chose Jacob to be Israel, God's own family, is faithful to that family he chose. He is a fortress for them, a fortress that can resist any attack at all. The psalm could be complete if it ended right here, but it continues for another section.
Come, perceive the works of the Lord, who has wrought great devastation in the land. The one who terminates wars to the end of the earth, breaks the bow and snaps the spear. He burns transport wagons with fire. Be still and acknowledge that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted throughout the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is a fortress for us. Selah.
The final section, Stronger Than All, opens with a call to God's people, and possibly a call to the nations as well, to come and inspect the battlefield where the Lord has fought his enemies. This pictures them coming to see for themselves how the battle ended. The Lord was not simply a defensive structure. The Lord was an offensive force as well, and he destroyed Jerusalem's enemies. He did not simply defeat the enemies, but he devastated them, which indicates they could never recover. God's angel ended the Assyrian attack under Sennacherib when the angel slaughtered 185,000 Assyrian soldiers overnight. When the soldiers who survived got up in the morning, they saw dead bodies lying everywhere around the camp. They quickly packed their tents and returned to Assyria. God defeats the enemies in this psalm in many ways that are definitely final. Not only are the enemies themselves devastated, but their weapons of war are broken. Even if they wanted to fight again, they would not have what they need to go to war. The bow and spear, which were standard military weapons, are broken. The transport wagons, which would bring food supplies, are on fire. An army without food and supplies would quickly become sick and hungry, and many soldiers would die. This is a picture of God's violence as a kind of judgment that ends all other violence. God violently destroys Jerusalem's enemies so that his people can live in peace. The Lord establishes that peace by his authority alone. He commands any enemies that still live, "Be still, stop the violence and fighting. Acknowledge me as the one and only God who rules." The only option now for those who try to fight against God's people is to surrender. No one can destroy his city when he fights on its behalf. The second half of verse 11 is important. The Lord does not fight as a servant of his people. He fights as their God, and he is the one who will be exalted and honored. This gives a slightly different tone to verse 12, as it repeats verse 8. In verse 8, the city was celebrating God's strength because he protected them from all their enemies. Here in verse 12, the focus shifts slightly. Instead of focusing on God's power, the poet focuses on God's choice to care for his people. It is remarkable that the Lord of hosts, the commander of the armies of heaven, who has just declared himself to be in control of all the earth, would choose to be with his people. The God of the whole universe is also the God of Jacob. And this is the God who has chosen to be a fortress for his people. He is the one who has triumphed over all enemies, and he is the one in whom they take refuge. That is their security. Psalm 46 weaves together two parallel experiences. The terror of being attacked by enemies who are far more powerful, depicted with images of natural disaster and chaos that change the shape of the earth, and the absolute confidence that their defensive structures will not fail because God himself will defend them. The psalm expresses this confidence with the picture of God not only defeating their enemies, but permanently ending their ability to fight wars and making everyone surrender to his own authority. We may be able to add a little more nuance if we understand this psalm with the history of the Assyrian siege in mind. This was a time other enemy nations were falling in defeat against a more powerful, aggressive enemy. When that enemy threatened God's city as well, it was like the people were watching foaming floodwaters destroy the landscape, even to the point of moving mountains from their place. But God's city had its own supply of good water that provided for the city instead of threatening it. So, in the psalm, the city has no fear while other kingdoms fall around it. The city and its people know that God is their fortress. They know they will see their God bring down the aggressive enemy, for he alone will be the one who can defeat all enemies. He will win for the sake of his people, because he has chosen to be their protector. With such a God, there is nothing his people can possibly fear. They know their God is stronger than natural forces, stronger than any enemy nations. In truth, their God is stronger than anything. This completes our section-by-section walkthrough of Psalm 46. We'll finish now with a reading of the text that brings everything together.
For the music director, by the Korahites, as young women, a psalm. God is a refuge and stronghold for us. He is readily available as a help in great trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Though the earth change and the mountains topple into the heart of the deepest sea, though its waters foam in rage, though mountains quake at its surging, Selah, there is a river whose streams gladden the city of God, the holy dwelling of the Most High. God is in its midst. It cannot be moved. God helps it at the approach of morning. When nations raged and kingdoms fell down, then he thundered with his voice, and the earth would melt. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is a fortress for us. Selah. Come, perceive the works of the Lord, who has wrought great devastation in the land. The one who terminates wars to the end of the earth, breaks the bow and snaps the spear. He burns transport wagons with fire. Be still and acknowledge that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted throughout the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is a fortress for us. Selah.